should do it. Let's see if I can turn this on. Okay, got it. Hi.
Hello.
My historical novel, A Tugging String. I gather some of you've read it, and I suspect many of you have not. So I'll proceed as though you have not, so you have all the information to really grasp it. Deals with issues of civil rights. You'll find out how this book is personal to me. It wasn't anything like a book report project, not at all. I wrote it because the material within very directly connects to my life. In order to understand the book completely, we have to review a little bit of American history. I suspect for most of you, you know this quite well, but let's just be certain that all of us are on the same page. Up until 1865 in America, there was slavery. And if we all went back in time before 1865, and let's say you're white and I'm black, you could own me. It wouldn't be as though I had quite human status as you do. I would rather, more accurately, have the status of a horse or a cow. I would belong to you, have no legal rights, of course. In 1865, shortly after the end of the Civil War, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution outlawed slavery. So, you might think, you black, all your troubles are over because now there's no more slavery. No, this was not at all the case, because even though slavery ended, the racist attitudes that had brought it about and perpetuated it were still prevalent in America. Not everywhere, not everyone, but still quite common. To such a degree that even when I was a kid, growing up in New York City and the area of New York City, all across America, there were expressions of racism to be seen. I can still remember going into an office building with my dad in New York City when I was a kid. And next to the elevator, there was a sign that said, "Coloreds use freight elevator." So in other words, the message is quite unambiguous. If you weren't white, you weren't considered good enough to use that main elevator, but you were directed to an elevator for freight cargo baggage in the back of the building. In my opinion, of all the rights denied or stymied to blacks in the era of my childhood and the years before, the most important one was the right to vote. Now, I'll state what's self-evident. Voting gives you a little bit of power in a democracy. If you find someone who represents your views, you vote him into office, or vice versa. If you cannot vote, you have no power, no voice in this country. Now, actually, blacks got the right to vote with the 15th Amendment to the Constitution in 1869. So here's an important question. Let's see, I'm really curious how many of you will know the answer. I suspect a few. When did women get the right to vote? Raise your hand, tell me. Yep.
I think it was 1971.
No, you're off. But I'm glad you tried. Give it another try. Yeah.
1920?
Yeah. With the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. It was a pitched battle. It passed by one vote. So we all go back in time before 1920 for most of the young ladies here, for the mothers of students, for any female professors on campus. The general attitude in America was you could not vote. You were female, intrinsically not intelligent enough to do so. However, you should not worry, because when you got married, your husband would do it for you. You can see, therefore, there's been great progress in attitudes towards women between then and now. So blacks got the right to vote in 1869. And again, you might think, okay, all trouble's over. But no, this was not the case. And again, racism was at the root of it. And here's why. In order to vote, you have to register to vote. It used to be, it was typical, voter registration offices were in courthouses. I don't know how it's done now, maybe online, I don't know. So you go in, you just fill out some paperwork and you'd be registered. Now, if you were white, this was easy. Again, I'm speaking of the era of my childhood, 1960s, and the years before that. If you were white, this was easy, but if you were black, often, not always, but often, all sorts of obstacles. Like you'd go to the voter registration office, they'd see you coming, they'd lock the door, you couldn't get in. Or this was typical. You'd go in, you'd fill out the paperwork, you'd hand it to the person on the other side of the counter, and they'd look at it, and this might very well be the response. Well, we see there's the letter I in your name, and there's a dot over the letter I. That is not a good dot. That's a low quality dot. That dot is not of sufficient quality to allow you to vote. Voter registration officials notoriously would pick on dots over I's or crosses in T's. Or, if you were black, you'd go to register to vote, they'd say, okay, you can register to vote, but know this, if you do, we're going to kill you. And that did happen in America. Or you're going to be fired from your job. One other technique, quite well known to stymie blacks from voting, registering to vote, were the literacy tests. If you're literate, you can read and write. Obviously, you're literate. So these were never given to whites, just blacks. You'd go in, they say, okay, you can register, but wait. First, we have to see if you're literate. I'm going to show you a literacy test right now. The top questions, for most of us, are just too difficult to answer. I'm reasonably educated, I can't answer them. But I think it's the last three questions that are most interesting. So these are actual literacy test questions. You want to vote, answer this question. How high is up? That's tough. How many seeds in a watermelon? That's challenging. And then the last one, you know, there's an element of humor to it at first glance. It sounds like the title of a Dr. Seuss book, but actually its intent was to be highly disrespectful and insulting. How many bubbles in a bar of soap? Now, you cannot answer that. You can't answer that. You can't register to vote. You can't register to vote. You cannot vote. You cannot vote. You have no legal means to change the racism that you face in America. So, in the 1960s, blacks began to demonstrate. And the whole idea of a demonstration is it would be on television, it would be in the newspapers, and it would help to shift public attitudes towards issues of racial justice. But when blacks demonstrated, look what the result often was. That lady there, I read about that lady. That lady wasn't even in the demonstration. That lady just happened to be walking down the street at the time of a demonstration, and they hauled her away. Police would often use high-pressure fire hoses to knock over demonstrators. We've all eaten in restaurants. It's typical. In the era of my childhood, even in New York City, which is not considered the South by any means, many restaurants would not allow you in as a customer if you were black. They began to have sit-ins. These guys, they were polite, they were respectful, they've done what you've done countless times, and they hauled them away. Now, I'm certain you are well aware that in the 1960s there was a famous black leader, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I'm certain you know that he believed in bringing racial justice for blacks, but only peaceful means acceptable. Inspired by Mahatma Gandhi of India, who used non-violent protest to kick out British colonialists. He believed violence always was wrong, never acceptable, as an issue of baseline morality. There was another famous leader in the 1960s, Malcolm X. Now, you know, I can sympathize with his point of view. It does make sense, in a way. He said, look, if people are beating us up and killing us, surely we have a right to do the same back to them. Violence can justify violence. And so, in the 1960s, I think as a great generalization, but a useful one, There were two major views on how to bring racial justice for blacks. Martin Luther King Jr., only nonviolent protest, only nonviolence acceptable. Malcolm X, violence can be justified. In March 1965, King's group decided to have a demonstration, actually a march, from a little town in Alabama called Selma, across a bridge that's now famous, the Edmund Pettus Bridge. It would go 60 miles, take 4 days, to the capital, Montgomery. The purpose of this march was to publicize voting rights injustices. There's a bit of a schedule mix-up, and King could not make it to his own march, and so he appointed his two top aides, John Lewis and Hosea Williams, to lead the march. However, there was a very powerful man in Alabama who wanted to stop the march, Governor George Wallace. He was an outspoken racist. No thought of trying to hide it behind a veil of rhetoric. He believed blacks should not have equal rights. When he was inaugurated governor of Alabama in 1963, he said, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And he told King's group, if you march, I'm going to call out the police to stop you. Let me read to you now from my book, What Happened Next. And so, on the morning of March 7, 1965, a day that would be known forever after as Bloody Sunday, John Lewis and Hosea Williams stood on the Selma side of the Edmund Pettus Bridge with 500 followers behind them. All along the shoulder of the road were cameramen and journalists from every major national television station and newspaper. In a line directly in front of the marchers, blocking the bridge, stood state troopers led by Major John Cloud, bulky gas masks dangling from their belts. Hosea Williams and John Lewis looked at each other. Williams whispered to Lewis, "Can you swim?" "No," said Lewis. "I can't either," said Williams, "and I'm sure we're going to end up in that river." John Lewis approached Cloud. "May I have a word with you, Major?" "There is no word to be had," Cloud replied. "You have 2 minutes to disperse." He started counting. "Sir," said Lewis. "Advance." But he was cut off. "Advance," called Major Cloud, and his troopers shoved into the crowd of marchers, hitting them with billy clubs. Troopers threw tear gas and nausea gas at the marchers. There was screaming, crying, confusion. Many marchers collapsed in pools of blood. All of a sudden, Cloud's troopers were joined by Sheriff James Clark and his squirrel shooters, 200 local posse men deputized for the occasion, many on horseback. Clark wore a white helmet. On his uniform was a button that said "Never," Governor Wallace's one-word slogan against integration. On one hip was a gun, on the other a nightstick. He shouted, "Get them!" Possemen on horseback ran over the marchers, the horse hooves breaking bones, cracking skulls. In some cases, a deputy ran over a marcher, then wheeled his horse and did it again and again and again. One marcher ran into the First Baptist Church and was followed by posse men who grabbed him and threw him through a stained glass window portraying Jesus the Good Shepherd. Posse men banged their nightsticks in cars and hollered, "We want all of you off the streets." Bang, bang, bang. Many marchers knelt and prayed, and posse men hit them with clubs made from rubber tubing wrapped in barbed wire, ripping open their skin, tearing open their scalps. Local white bystanders cheered. Not a single marcher fought back. All of this was captured by still cameras and television cameras. Reporters took notes. Almost every demonstrator was arrested and taken to jail, or if badly injured, the hospital. Before entering the hospital with a skull fracture, John Lewis spoke to remaining marchers. "I don't see how President Johnson can send troops to Vietnam, and he can't send troops to Selma, Alabama. Next time we march, we may have to keep going when we get to Montgomery. We may have to go on to Washington." I saw this on TV. If you ever see this happen, it's alarming. You're watching a show and it just stops. A voice comes over. In this case, it said, "We interrupt this program." Those are ominous words. In this case, to bring you breaking news from Selma, Alabama. There it was, Bloody Sunday. I saw it. Millions of Americans saw it. And so did President Johnson. Now, President Johnson was a complicated guy. He had started out his career as a school teacher in Texas. Most of his students were Hispanic, their skin of a darker shade, and there was a lot of prejudice in the white community against his kids. Now, he's a teacher. If you know anything about teachers, they love their students. He loved his kids. And he felt a sympathy for them, and by extension for King and his cause. But this was, a tough time in American history, the era of the Vietnam War. Most historians would agree we were losing the war. The stress of this came down on the commander-in-chief. Some historians say the stress of running the war actually was killing him. He was concerned. If he supported King, he would push away people who supported his policies in Vietnam. He was up for re-election soon. He was concerned if he supported King, he would push away people who might vote for him. One more thing about President Johnson, which comes forth from his wife's memoirs. He always felt unappreciated. He would tell his wife, Martin Luther King doesn't appreciate me. I've done so much for him. He's not grateful. He should say thank you to me. But no, he keeps asking for stuff. Let me read to you now from my book a scene that I think conveys Johnson's response to Bloody Sunday. In front of the White House gates, crowds protesting the Vietnam War were joined by a small group of demonstrators waving placards, chanting, and angrily shouting about the lack of government response to the violence in Selma. President Johnson, his wife Lady Bird, and his top aide Clark Clifford were bundled onto his helicopter by Secret Service, and the chopper arced upward. The president could see the demonstrators below shaking their fists angrily at his helicopter, and him. He could barely make out a sign one was waving up at him. LBJ, just you wait, see what happens in '68. He hated being hated. What do you think we should do about King and his demonstrators in Selma, he asked Clifford. As you know, much of your support for Vietnam comes from the South, said Clifford. The Southern states are absolutely dead set against making any concession to King and his people. On the other hand, said Clifford, demonstrations are erupting across the country in support of King. Everyone saw the police attack peaceful demonstrators. Here, read this telegram from Jackie Robinson. He's a hero to all baseball fans, Negro and white. I hope you know, but if not, I'll tell you right now. It used to be in America, unless you were white, you could not play major league sports. Jackie Robinson was so unbelievably talented that the Brooklyn Dodgers, a team at the time, took what they thought was a big risk. It hired him. It was said of Jackie Robinson that he broke the color barrier. He became one of the first sports superstars in America. He was a celebrity. He was rich. He was beloved. He had his own TV show. And when he spoke, people listened, even the President of the United States. Here's a telegram that he sent to Johnson. Important you take immediate action in Alabama. One more day of savage treatment by legalized hatchet men could lead to open warfare by aroused Negroes. America could not afford this in 1965. Said Johnson. So either way I'm in trouble. You know, said Johnson, since Lincoln freed the slaves, I have done more for the Negroes of this nation than any other president, and they do not appreciate me for it. They do not appreciate me. And if I support King, it may require federal troops. And if I bring in federal troops, we may have open warfare in the streets, and that may set back the civil rights movement for years. President Johnson thought momentarily of the endless bad news from Vietnam. He thought of riots in which whites and Negroes would hatefully call out against him, and made a quick calculation. Write a forceful, eloquent paper for me that I can read on national television in complete support of King. In 1965, I would have been 11 years old. This was big news. President Johnson's address to Congress, in which he proposed something called the Voting Rights Act. In a nutshell, he proposed a law so that if you use tricks or threats to prevent someone from voting, it would be a federal crime. Now, you commit a federal crime and you go to the federal penitentiary, the big house. You don't want to do that. Johnson was trying to use the power of law to stop the racists. Let me read you a little bit from his speech to Congress. Many of the issues of civil rights are very complex and most difficult, but about this there can and should be no argument. Every American citizen must have an equal right to vote. There is no reason which can excuse the denial of that right. There is no duty which weighs more heavily on us than the duty we have to ensure that right. Yet the harsh fact is that in many places in this country, men and women are kept from voting simply because they are Negroes. Wednesday, I will send to Congress a law, the Voting Rights Act, designed to eliminate illegal barriers to the right to vote. So, let me review. Up until 1865, slavery. In 1869, blacks get the right to vote. However, the reality is, racist voter registration officials across America, in many cases, stop or stymie blacks from voting. Blacks begin to demonstrate. In March 1965, King's group marches from Selma. The racist governor, George Wallace, calls out the police. There's Bloody Sunday. It's on TV. I see it, and millions of Americans see it. So does President Johnson. He proposes the Voting Rights Act. Now, Martin Luther King wants to march once more in order to rally public opinion, so people will tell their representatives to vote for the Voting Rights Act and make it law. He's worried if he does so, that George Wallace will call out the police, and people will be beat up and killed. And then Malcolm X comes to Selma, Alabama, and he publicly says, that's right, we're going to march, and if we get beat up, we're going to fight back. Now, King is very worried that instead of things getting better, everything will dissolve in fights and riots and get worse. And so King has to find a way to get around Governor Wallace's order forbidding the march. And there's only one way that can be done in America, and that is if a federal judge in the same district as the governor rules that the governor's order is illegal. Now, to argue before a federal judge, you need a lawyer. And that's where the story becomes very personal for me, because my father was Martin Luther King's lawyer. You can see him there. He's the white guy. And off to the far side is my father's boss at the time, Thurgood Marshall, who at the time that picture was taken never could have imagined that years later he would go on to become the first black Supreme Court Justice of the United States. Here's another picture of my dad. I love his haircut. On the steps of the United States Supreme Court, next to Thurgood Marshall, after he helped to argue a court case called Brown versus Board of Education. I suspect you know, but in case you don't, I'm going to tell you. It used to be many public schools in America, not all, but many, would only let you attend if you were white. If you weren't white, you went to some third-rate school someplace else. The Supreme Court ruled this was against the law. All children, regardless of the color of their skin, are considered equal in the eyes of the law and entitled to the same education together. One more picture of my dad. You can see King there in the back of the room. There's John Lewis. I was always scared when my dad went down south to help King, because there had been many threats to kill my father. And I was scared he would go down south, but he would not come back alive. And this is no idle fantasy of mine. Here is a memo that my father got from the FBI. They didn't want to give it to him. He had to sue them under the Freedom of Information Act to get it. That will give you some sense of the danger he sometimes was in. My dad told me that one time he flew south to help King, and instead of his airplane pulling up to the terminal, it circled back to the start of the runway, and he was asked to get out into a police car lined in phone books because there had been a threat to kill him by sniper. And the thought was that phone books could absorb a sniper bullet. On another occasion, my dad was down south to help King, and he was in his hotel room working on his court case for the next day, and it was hot. So he thought he'd open up the window. He went to the window to open up the window, and as it is with windows, he looked out the window, and outside the window, the entire local chapter of the Ku Klux Klan was there, pointing up at his window. The guy who runs a chapter of the Klan is called the Wizard or the Cyclops. The wizard of this group, my father later came to learn, owned the local car dealership. And he was sitting on the hood of a car, holding the hood ornament like a saddle horn, and circling the street in front of my dad's hotel room. He told me the only thing he knew to do was to take all the furniture in the room and push it against the door, which would slow someone down if they tried to get in, and to lie down on the floor, which would make him less of a target. Now, the Ku Klux Klan is of no danger to anyone nowadays. They are a puny group, and no one should have any fear. But when I was a kid, they were dangerous. They were dangerous. I'll never forget, I went to my mailbox to get a magazine. Instead of pulling out a magazine, I pulled out this slightly raggedy newspaper. I opened it up. The Thunderbolt, comma, newspaper of the Ku Klux Klan. And there was a picture of my dad with a caption beneath that read, "Vicious Jew Jack Greenberg." I just almost collapsed because everybody knew they were killers, and it was just a known fact. And they had our address. We figured they got it from the phone book. And obviously did not think much of my dad. The Ku Klux Klan, in my view, represents the worst of America. I've always wondered, how are they so hateful? Everybody knows they hate blacks, but they hate all sorts of people. They hate Asians, they hate Hispanics, they hate Jews, they hate immigrants, they hate Catholics. I mean, that's a lot of hate. And so I pondered, how do people hate lots and lots of other people whom they've never met? This, I suspect you know, is not an uncommon phenomenon around the world, nor throughout history. And I think the answer is this. Here's the best answer I can come up with, and I'll just show it to you in pictures. Here is how people are capable of great hatred. That's it. But it gets worse. Get this. Because as much as love for your fellow human, respect for your fellow human, tolerance, decency, acceptance are values transmitted parent to child, disrespect, hatefulness, intolerance, etc. The Ku Klux Klan used to be a significant group in America. You know, there's groups that adults join. Some of you may someday, like Shriners or Rotary or Elks. You know, there's civic groups, and you get together, you socialize a bit, and you do good deeds. And I think for many people, the Ku Klux Klan was roughly on par with that years ago. There used to be a calling card they'd give out, and it said, "A girl loves a man from the Ku Klux Klan." And the Ku Klux Klan was enough of a sub-society that you could get Ku Klux Klan comics. You know, before all the digital stuff, Ku Klux Klan music. On that special day, you could get a Ku Klux Klan birthday cake. If you wanted to raise your daughter with good Klan values, dolls. If you wanted to support your local Klan merchant, you could get Ku Klux Klan shampoo, Ku Klux Klan mouthwash, vitamins. Here's a little thing to show how they don't like Catholics. I'm Jewish, and my wife is Christian, and for her, the cross is a very important symbol that she connects, I think, I speak fairly well for her, with the best of humankind, who we can be. And so for her, it is particularly disturbing to see how the Ku Klux Klan has taken that symbol to use for purposes of hatefulness. They just threw that in, they dress up their horses. I always wondered, why did my dad take a job where some people hated him and some people wanted to kill him? I think there's two reasons. One, my dad's Jewish, I'm Jewish. And I'm certain you're well aware there has been prejudice against Jews. Over 6 million Jewish men, women, children killed by the Nazis in concentration camps in World War II simply out of a hatred of Jews. When my dad went to college, for most colleges in America, they would not accept you if you were black. Not allowed in. For Jews, they had what were called, and they spoke with this openly, and it would be in their literature, Jew quotas. So, we'll let in no blacks, but we'll let in 4 Jews, or 6 Jews. And in fact, the year that my father went to a school in New York City called Columbia College, they let in 6 Jews, he among them, that year. And so I think that my dad growing up with some prejudice towards himself and others he knew. I just think he felt sympathy for other people in the same situation. Also, my dad fought in World War II. He was a junior lieutenant on a kind of ship called an LST. That's his actual ship right there. That's his ship. Landing Ship Tank. Most ships, of course, anchor offshore. You can see there's a door in front. Even at sea, that door could open up and amphibious vehicles could come out, or it could slide onto a beach. It was armored, under fire. And the door would open up and tanks and Marines would come out. He was in charge of an anti-aircraft gun unit called a Bofors that had 4 barrels that could fire heavy shells at high speed. Here's exactly what his Bofors looked like. He was in the major battles of World War II in the Pacific. He was at the invasion of Iwo Jima. He was in the first wave to hit the beach at a time when they were taking 95% casualties on the beach. Those were our fellow Americans. And here's a ship. Here's a picture of his ship shortly after the landing. You can see the front doors opened up. Here's a picture of him several weeks later. After Iwo Jima, he went to another major battle of World War II, Okinawa. In one day at Okinawa, over 2,000 kamikaze planes came in trying to destroy the American fleet. My dad's Bofors, every Bofors in the fleet was firing at the kamikazes. My dad's ship, LST-715, was next to the pride of the American fleet, a destroyer. You can see it in battle paint there, the USS Drexler. The Drexler was formidable. It could go faster than a speedboat. It could go over 50 miles an hour. I mean, that's like getting this college campus up to 50 miles an hour. It could fire a shell that weighed 1,000 pounds, 20 miles with accuracy. And they were zigzagging to avoid torpedoes. So my father's ship is here and the Drexler's right next to him. They were firing at the kamikazes. They knocked down almost every kamikaze, but one got through. Hit the Drexler right in the center. And the mighty Drexler sank in less than 60 seconds. Of a crew of over 600, only about half were saved. I asked my dad, what was it like at Okinawa? And he told me, well, the one thing he remembered most was at night. It was like the sky was on fire. And here is a picture that perhaps gives some sense of what he saw. And so I think my dad was influenced by his Jewish background and by fighting in World War II, where he learned when you're attacked, you don't run off, but you stand up strong and do what's necessary courageously. So in March 1965, he left our home in New York to fly to Montgomery, Alabama, to argue before federal judge Frank Johnson that Governor Wallace's order forbidding King's March was illegal and that King should be permitted to march. Now this guy is a great American hero. Oh, he was at the invasion of Normandy to liberate Europe from the Nazis as an infantryman, and he got shot up. All his life he carried a bullet in his body that surgeons were unable to remove. He was in pain all the time, never ever spoke of it. I know that all of you are familiar with Rosa Parks, the courageous black woman sat in the front of the bus, they hauled her away. Well, you get arrested, you end up in court. Her court case ended up before him, Frank Johnson. Frank Johnson ruled that Rosa Parks had a perfect right to sit in the front of the bus. The police were wrong, she was right. At which point, the Ku Klux Klan bombed his house. But he was tough, not about to be scared off. Let me read you a little bit from the actual court arguments before Frank Johnson. The court bailiff rapped his gavel 3 times, asked everyone to stand, and said, "God save the United States in this honorable court." Greenberg was accompanied by a local black lawyer, Fred Gray. In Montgomery, as in other towns, Greenberg worked with courageous black lawyers. They lived there, hence so had to remain there when Greenberg returned to the safety of the North. Fred Gray was ready when Greenberg needed help in Montgomery. He was the Montgomery lawyer who, in the face of many threats had successfully represented Rosa Parks. The opposing lawyer representing Governor George Wallace in the state of Alabama spoke first. Your Honor, the state is against King's March for two reasons. One, if King marches, this will agitate locals who may attack the marchers. If the marchers fight back, the violence will threaten public safety. And two, Your Honor, King's March will interfere with traffic. Greenberg stood. May it please the court. The First Amendment of the Constitution protects King's right to express his beliefs. Greenberg introduced King as his first witness and asked him what he meant by nonviolence. One must have the inner determination to resist what conscience tells him is evil, with all of the strength and courage and zeal that he can muster. At the same time, he must not resort to violence or hatred in the process. The opposing lawyer addressed King. Why, sir, should anyone believe you? You have been jailed countless times, which makes you an ex-convict. You have defied an order by the governor, sir, the governor. Objection, said Greenberg. The state attorney's manner is antagonistic and insulting. Johnson, sustained. All witnesses in this court, regardless of who they are to be interrogated with common courtesy. I'm trying, said the state's attorney. Make a little better effort, said Johnson. Greenberg and the state's attorney spoke a bit more and the proceedings ended. They would have to wait the weekend to hear Judge Johnson's decision. So this hearing took place on a Friday morning. They had to wait Friday afternoon, Saturday, Sunday, Monday morning, in great suspense. Would federal judge Frank Johnson agree with Governor Wallace and forbid the march, or with Martin Luther King and permit the march? You know, a picture's worth 1,000 words. Instead of telling you in words, I'll show you the picture and you'll know his decision. This picture was taken several minutes after Frank Johnson's decision was released to the public. Get this, I love this picture. You can see my dad's pretty happy. You can see Martin Luther King's pretty happy. The Ku Klux Klan wasn't happy though. They bombed Frank Johnson's house again. And they bombed Frank Johnson's mother's house. And for the rest of their lives, Frank Johnson and his mother had to be protected 24 hours a day by federal agents. And so on March 15, 1965, King started out in Selma with 500 followers behind him on the march that would go 4 days, 60 miles to the capital, Montgomery. I just want to show you one guy in the march, just an anonymous guy. But I just love this guy. Look at him. Now, my dad had argued that King had the right to march because the First Amendment of the Constitution protected his right of free expression. Let's just think about that for a second. We take it for granted. If you've done any world travel, maybe you will. I suspect some of you have. There are places in this world you speak your mind and you will be in terrible trouble for so doing. It is one of the great rights we have in this country. Often, however, it protects those whom you or I might find obnoxious. And so all along the route of the march, there were racists who had the First Amendment guarantee to express their views. When I was a kid, if there's anyone in this room of my vintage, you'll know that communist was hurled quite easily in those days, and people with long hair, my hair was a lot longer back then. It wasn't a political statement, I just didn't like getting haircuts. There were those who would mutter communist simply for something like that. Here's a guy you can only hope you're not related to. President Johnson called up Governor Wallace and said, I'm scared there's going to be violence. I want you to call out the Alabama National Guard. Wallace said, I ain't going to do it. So Johnson did something never before done in American history. He fired the governor, and he took over. He said, you're the governor, I'm the commander-in-chief. He ordered the Alabama National Guard out. They were all along the route. There were helicopters overhead, and they marched. And soon, people from all over America, this was just a galvanic event in America. They saw this on TV. They hopped in their cars and just drove to Alabama. Parked the car by the side of the road and got in behind King. He soon had up to 5,000 people behind him. And not only kind of like, you know, regular old people like us, but lots of the superstars that they came out. I'm going to show you a lady now. And I'm going to show this just because it shows how fleeting is fame, who no one knows anymore. I'd like to see if anyone can recognize her. I'm going to guess no. But in her day, she was like a Lady Gaga superstar. Lady Gaga, who would name their child that? That's just a radical choice. Anyone recognize her?
Joan Baez?
Yeah, Joan Baez. Who, interestingly, years later became the girlfriend of Steve Jobs, who was a dropout from the college I attended. What do you make of that? Catholic Church is one of the groups that is an ardent supporter of human rights. A lot of nuns there. There's Hosea Williams, John Lewis. There they are going over the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Not everyone by the side of the road, as you may imagine, was against the march. Here they are coming up Dexter Avenue into Montgomery. There's King, there's Lewis. Those are police protecting the State House. Another view. Now, at this point, George Wallace has been squished by the formidable President Johnson. But King is about to speak on those State House steps. And so, I love this option here. I'll show you his office. Oh yeah, that's his office. He opened the window, closed the shades, got down on his knees, and kind of poked his ear out so he could hear Martin Luther King speak. Let me read you a little bit of his speech. Of all his speeches, it's my favorite. Last Sunday, we started on a mighty walk from Selma, Alabama. We have walked on meandering highways and rested our bodies on rocky byways. Some of our faces are burned from the outpourings of the sweltering sun. Some have literally slept in the mud. We have been drenched by the rains. All the world today knows that we are here and that we are standing before the forces of power in the state of Alabama saying, we ain't going to let nobody turn us around. Confrontation of good and evil compressed in the tiny community of Selma generated the massive power to turn the whole nation to a new course. So I stand before you this afternoon with a conviction that segregation is on its deathbed in Alabama, and the only thing uncertain about it is how costly the segregationists in Wallace will make the funeral. Our whole campaign in Alabama has been centered around the right to vote. Today I want to say to the people of America and the nations of the world, we are not about to turn around. We are on the move now. Yes, we are on the move, and no wave of racism can stop us. We must come to see that the end we seek is a society at peace with itself, a society that can live with its conscience. That would be a day not of the white man, not of the black man. That would be the day of man as man. I know you are asking today, how long will it take? I come to say to you this afternoon it will not be long, because truth pressed to earth will rise again. How long? Not long. Because the arm of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. There were immediate effects to the speech. The first effect was tragic. There was a white woman named Viola Liuzzo, a homemaker in Detroit, who saw the march on TV. She just hopped in her car, drove to Alabama to help out. At the end of the march, it was her job to take people to and from to the airport to go home. She was coming back from a run to the airport, and her companion in the car was male and black, which to the KKK they just couldn't stand that. It drove them crazy. They drove up alongside her and they shot her dead. There were many eyewitnesses, including an FBI informant, but an all-white jury in Alabama let the shooter go. Years later, he was tried on lesser charges in a federal court. And he spent a few years in jail, but I don't think he ever paid the price he should have for the crime he committed. America saw King's march, they heard his speech, and the best angels of our nature came forth. People told their representatives to vote for the Voting Rights Act. With one exception, it was unanimously voted in as law, and immediately things began to change in America. Blacks began to register to vote. And I'll show you a guy who, according to my research, I believe, as the first man of African American descent elected to office in the South after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. I just like the way he looks. Some of you vote. Your parents certainly vote. Your teachers vote. I vote. If you're not voting now, you will in a year or two. And you vote for those who represent your views, and that's exactly as it should be in our democracy. Blacks had mainly been stymied from doing this. They could vote now. John Lewis, he was beat up on Bloody Sunday. He was voted in as a congressman. He's a congressman today. Blacks began to be voted into high office as congressmen, senators, governors, school board superintendents, sheriffs. Other minority groups were inspired by this. Oh yeah. Hispanics, up until recently. Bill Richardson was a highly respected governor of New Mexico. Women said,